Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Jesse. I'm the director of the Memorial Art Gallery. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is exciting because we are celebrating the opening of an exciting new exhibition called Past Forward, Native American Art from the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It is very fortunate that we have our two co-curators here with us today who are real experts and did an incredible job putting together this rich, substantive show. So I'm glad that all of you are here to hear from them. And in just a moment, I'll turn it over to them. For now, I'd like to open this event with our land acknowledgement. The Memorial Art Gallery in the University of Rochester sits on the lands of the Haudenosaunee people, specifically the Seneca Nation. We aim to promote the important and myriad contributions to art, culture, and society of Native Americans to effect positive change in our community. This exhibition was co-organized by the American Federation of the Arts and Gilcrease Museum, and I'm very pleased that in addition to our co-presenters today, we also have the brand new executive director of Gilcrease Museum here with us, Brian Lee Wisenhunt. Thank you, Brian, for being here. This show would not be possible without our various generous and philanthropic supporters who've allowed us to bring this show here. I'd like to acknowledge them now, including Caitlin and Ben Kierker, Marion Sweat Robinson. Additional support was provided by Richard Bloom, Michael Feinstein, Charlotte Emerul Herrera, Tom and Ebitz Judson, Ronald Lovell, the Robert and Mary Sproul Fund, the Nancy Turner Fund for Temporary Exhibitions, and the Claymore and Good Voice Elk Family Fund. Please join me in thanking our generous supporters. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the co-curators of the exhibition, Chelsea Herr and Janet Catherine Berlo. Chelsea is the curator of Indigenous Art and Culture at the Gilcrease Museum in Oklahoma, and she holds a PhD from the University of Oklahoma. Before joining Gilcrease, she was a researcher at the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City, and she worked extensively at the Couse Sharp Historic Site in Taos, New Mexico, where she curated an exhibition called Stitched in Sovereignty, Contemporary Beadwork from Indigenous North America. She was also the guest co-curator for an exhibition called Indigenous Futurisms, Transcending Past, Present, and Future that was on view at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. Janet Catherine Berlo is kind of a legend here in Rochester. She is Professor Emeritus at the University of Rochester, where she first joined as the Susan B. Anthony Professor of Gender Studies and Professor of Art History. She has a PhD in art history from Yale, and she is the author of many publications, including Native North American Art, Plains Indian Drawings, 1865 to 1935, Spirit Beings and Sun Dancers, Black Hawk's Vision of a Lakota World, Arthur Amiot Collages from 1988 to 2006, and her most recent publication, Not Native American Art, Fakes, Replicas, and Invented Traditions, which was published just last year. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our distinguished curators.
I control the remote, so if things go wonky, it's my fault. It's her fault.
And our mics are on, yes. We're so happy to be here. We're so happy for the beautiful job that the installation and design team here did. Mm-hmm. We're so grateful to the curatorial staff who has managed every detail with aplomb, and so happy that this has occurred under the new directorship of Sarah Jesse. So thanks for coming. So Chelsea will start us off, because here's who it starts with, Mr. Gilcrease himself.
So Gilcrease Museum, which is in Tulsa, as Sarah mentioned. Also, the long name is the Thomas Gilcrease Institute of American History and Art. We don't ever really take the time to say all that, so we call it Gilcrease Museum. But was founded really by Thomas Gilcrease, whose portrait you can see here on the right, who was a Muskogee citizen a citizen of the Muskogee Nation in Oklahoma, so he himself was Indigenous. He received an allotment as part of the allotment system that was giving 160 acres to enrolled tribal citizens in Oklahoma at the time. And on that allotment, just south of Tulsa, in a town called Glenpool, like many other stories around the same time period in the early 20th century, he discovered oil quite by accident. He was 11 years old, so he wasn't out looking for it. But oil was discovered on his allotment, and so all of a sudden, he, like many other Native folks at that time, was thrust into obscene wealth that was managed and envied and sought after by other people, right? And so he had to figure out pretty quickly as a young man how to kind of fend for himself both financially and in this world of art, that he decided that's where he wanted to invest his money, was in collecting cultural materials, archival materials, artworks that represent and tell the story of the history of now the Western Hemisphere, the entire Western Hemisphere. So our collection, because of his voracious collecting habits that eventually bankrupt him, is about 350,000 objects today in our collection from, as I said, the entire Western Hemisphere, from about 10 to 12,000 years ago until today. It's quite broad, it's quite large range of materials, but like I said, he had such a hunger for knowledge, and especially knowledge related to the Indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, so that our collection currently is about 65% Indigenous in origin. And so that is a really unique story, a foundational story to have for a museum of the size and of the caliber of Gilcrease in Tulsa. So that's kind of the background on where we are. And I particularly like this portrait here, which you can see in the gallery right towards the front of the exhibition. This is painted by one of Gilcrease's favorite artists at the time that he was living, Charles Banks Wilson, but it shows him with an ancestral Caddo pot that is still in the collection, as well as a book that is still in our archive of engravings by Theodore Debris, which are probably familiar to many, many people, as well as the original building that is both in the photograph on your left, but also behind Thomas Gilcrease in that painting. So that building is no more.
One of the things that it interested us to focus on when we were planning this show is people didn't used to make too much of the fact that Mr. Gilcrease was Native, because of course he came up in an age when Americans sought to downplay whatever their ethnicity was if it was not mainstream white American. My French-Canadian mother did that. Native people I know who are my age or older were taught to do that. Thomas Gilcrease never made much of the fact that he was Native. So we thought, interesting for us to put a slant on the fact that this was like the first collection made by an Indigenous man with his taste, and he worked with Indigenous artists of his era, and so their taste was involved too. And so this is quite extraordinary in the history of museum, museum development in this country. This was one of the artists with whom he worked, Willard Stone, and there are two pieces by Willard Stone in the gallery that you can look at. It's interesting that in some cases, Mr. Gilcrease sought quantity over quality. There are a lot of not very interesting Willard Stone wood sculptures in the Gilcrease, but there are a few that just would knock you out. And he was particularly concerned about the atomic bomb in World War II, and the two pieces that are in the gallery are about that. Here, however, you see him with Mr. Gilcrease and a wood sculpture that he made of Mr. Gilcrease. Gilcrease gave fellowships to a number of artists who lived on the grounds and worked full-time, something that really didn't happen to Native artists in the 30s and 40s, except here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that included Willard Stone. You'll also see works by Woody Crumbo. He was another artist in residence, an early collector on behalf of Gilcrease, as well as A.C. Blue Eagle. So he was, Thomas Gilcrease was really literally investing in the work of living artists at the time, as well as in historical and, not so recent cultural materials as well. So what I said earlier, that building is no more. One of the kind of the impetus, let's say, for the timing of this particular exhibition for Past Forward is that Gilcrease Museum in 2014, I believe it was, we received a very generous package from the voters of Tulsa to rehab the museum. Over the decades since the first iteration of this building in 1949, up until 2020, when we started demolition, it became a patchwork kind of building with add-ons and additions and renovations over kind of once a decade that never worked well together. So the building was not adequate for the type of collection that we have. It was putting the collection at risk, right? And since it is our responsibility to make sure that that collection is preserved and is, held in high regard for the citizens of Tulsa, that means we need a new building in order to do that appropriately. So on your left there, I just included, it was on the news for quite a while in Tulsa about the demolition of Gilcrease Museum. And then on the right, the top right, is our architectural drawing for the new building. You can see downtown Tulsa. We have a beautiful view of the city from where we are in North Tulsa. And on the bottom right is a relatively recent, I think it's a couple months old now, aerial view of that same angle as the architectural plan. And really the goal for this new building is, yes, to provide a fantastic visitor experience. That's always going to be top of mind, right? But we really have to be sure that the items in our care are actually being cared for. So while we're doing all of this, while we're making sure that this collection continues as far into the future as it is possible, we wanted to share pieces of our collection with communities that maybe don't normally get to see it, and with institutions that we haven't had relationships with in the past. So Past Forward was an excellent way of, one, getting some of our collections items out into new communities and making those new relationships, but also hearing from folks that we don't get to hear from on a regular basis. So that was kind of the jumping off point for this exhibition.
So as you can imagine, here we are in 2024. We started this process in mid-2020. I've never been a full-time museum curator, but I've curated a lot of exhibits. I'm 71 years old, and never in my career have I curated a show where I have never seen any of the objects in person until I walked into that gallery yesterday. Frightening, frightening, frightening. But luckily, so I couldn't go to Tulsa. We were on lockdown, but Chelsea was there. Even though the museum was closed, she could go into the storerooms and so forth. But it's quite a challenge to co-curate a show during lockdown. We wanted to show a range of the strengths of the material from ancient to modern, and especially to focus on some of the art from the first half of the 20th century that Mr. Gilcrease collected, because it seemed to us that outside of, say, Oklahoma and the Southwest, a lot of Americans are not familiar with that art. I was pretty sure, and I am pretty sure, that some people will come into this show and say, where are the totem poles? Where are the Navajo rugs? Where are the splendid masks of the Northwest Coast? Well, those were not the strengths of his collection. So while focusing on the strengths of the collection, we also wanted to focus on a period of Native American art history that scholars have been talking about and interpreting in new ways for about 30 years now, but that a lot of the general public still doesn't know. Mm-hmm. But Chelsea spent a lot of time taking pictures in the storeroom and sending me very high quality JPEGs, or reporting back that, no, we can't have that pot because on the other side it's completely broken, or no, the conservator won't let us use this drawing because it's very faded and can't stand up to a traveling show. And in the exhibit, we decided on 4 organizational themes. And when you go through the show, you could probably say to yourself, well, some of these pieces could be in another section. And yes, indeed, they could. But we wanted to focus on themes of abstraction, ceremony, sovereignty, and identity, all of which carry from the past through forward into the present and the future of Native American art and life.
And the abstraction section was, one of my favorites to work on because I am enamored with the fact that Indigenous peoples around the world, not specific to the Americas or to North America, but around the world, have been using abstract visual languages for millennia, right? And often when we talk about abstraction in the context of art history, art historians are referring to that kind of mid-century capital M modernism, in which abstraction becomes, pure color and shape, and allowing whatever the material is to be itself, right? We often associate that with the last 100 years or so. That's not the case for many Native North American communities. And in fact, those early capital M modern artists from Europe and from eventually the United States derived a lot of those concepts from the visual cultures of Indigenous peoples. So the abstraction section, I included 2 really, for me, poignant examples of Native makers using these abstract visual languages, which is really simplifying down complex ideas, what could be complicated aesthetics, into essential or much more easy to digest forms, right? So on the top right there is one of the oldest items in the exhibition. This is called a bird stone, and they're pretty ubiquitous across the woodlands regions, prehistoric woodlands region. And they often come in a shape similar to this. This is called a pop-eyed birdstone because, you see a pretty prominent beak, right? And you see its tail at the back, but it seems to have these, for me, I first read them actually as Hopi squash blossom buns, but that's just me. But they're called pop-eyed because it looks like it has these 2 eyes popping out. The birdstones that have been found over the years, that have been unearthed over the years, likely are not ceremonial or funerary in context, but there have been some theories about what they could be used for. I read a recent one that suggested they could be used for basket weaving because they're often found along areas that have reeds. Yeah, it's a recent theory. But for the purposes of this exhibition, the point is the maker of this item specifically selected that porphyry stone, likely because of its aesthetic qualities, the natural kind of discolorations throughout the stone, and has a fine hand at rendering this incredibly elegant, sophisticated, and abstract bird shape. And then on the left there is a more recent and well-known artist, Alan Hauser, who was Chiricahua Apache. And this is a relatively small version of a sculpture that he made several times. He cast several editions of it called Respite. And in this, when we think about 20th century abstraction in terms of Native art, Hauser is often a figure that comes up in those conversations for obvious reasons. But the way that he abstracts this woman's form, the way she's kind of grasping onto her knee, but the entire form of her body seems to be draped in a cloth, right? She's one solid mass. He's abstracted the planes of her arms, so they're kind of flattened out. You don't have a lot of detail really in the draping of what looks to be cloth or in the features of her face because those aren't the most significant parts of the sculpture, right? And I thought that these two pieces really speak well to one another, I think.
Another section of the exhibit is ceremony. As you all understand, I'm sure, the need for ceremony is part of what makes us human. In every culture, being human, human in a particular culture is defined by the ceremonies you have, which might include where you go for those ceremonies, what you wear for them, sacred objects that you use. And so we included some works of art related to ceremony. I'm very pleased that in the show these two works are next to each other, just as they are in my slides here. Both of these works by a native artist and a non-native one are about the corn dance. Some of you might know the American artist John Marin, who witnessed the corn dance in 1930. And he wrote a letter to his pal, Alfred Stieglitz, and he said, "Certain passages in the dance itself are so beautiful that to produce something, to produce a work of art, having seen it, becomes worthless. It's like grafting onto perfection. It's like rewriting Bach." And I just thought that was such an amazing insight of his. You know, artists can't necessarily improve upon reality. Nevertheless, many artists, both native and non-native, have painted the corn dance. And in Pueblo societies, there are many ceremonies that are private. These are ceremonies that predate the coming of the Spaniards. Some of them outsiders don't know when they take place. They may take place in the kiva, the ceremonial house. But there are also many ceremonies that combine Catholic religion, Catholic ceremonial practice that the Spaniards brought in the 16th century, and those are mixed with many traditional beliefs. And outsiders are often allowed to come to these, and outsiders are often allowed to photograph at them, or have been for much of the 20th century. For a long time, outsiders were not, and are not now, allowed to make representations of them, to stand there and draw or paint. But both native and non-native artists then went home and made their paintings and drawings. The one by Fred Caboti on the right, it takes place at Santo Domingo, Pueblo, on the Feast of St. Dominic, which is August 4th. And what you see here is that after a morning mass, the statue of St. Dominic is carried from the church to a shrine that has been built for it on the plaza. And members of the Squash and the Turquoise clans, two ancient clans, each of which has their own ceremonial kiva that private ceremonies take place in, they alternate in dancing for the saint. And as a young scholar, I spent a lot of time in the Southwest, and I was very fortunate to witness a lot of ceremonies. And I went one Christmas season. I was raised Catholic, and so I'm familiar with the ceremonies of the Christmas season. But to see the masked dancers dance into the church and present bread at the foot of the altar, you know, I turned to my then husband, raised Jewish, and I said, "We didn't do this in Catholicism in Massachusetts." So again, even Catholicism is a beautiful mix of ancient and modern religion. So at the left, you see a painting by Joseph Henry Sharp, a non-native artist who traveled to the Pueblos in 1893 and first painted the corn dance there that summer. But 56 years later, this is his final version of the corn dance that he painted at age 90. He presents a close-up version of one line of dancers caught in the sunshine against the backdrop of the Pueblo. And you know, there are other versions of the corn dance or aspects of the dancers that are in either this exhibit or iterations of it that are going to other museums, because a lot of the fragile works on paper are substituted when it goes to a new museum. So the people at the next stop in Miami Beach will see different versions of the corn dance.
And then our third section, in no particular order necessarily, just the third in this presentation, is sovereignty. And this is a topic that, as you can tell, they're pretty broad topics, like Janet mentioned. Objects might seem like they could go in one or more of each of these topics, but they're issues that Indigenous communities, especially in what is now the United States, contend with on a daily basis, right? So these are what I like to think of as glimpses into the day-to-day lives of what our communities, the language that we use with one another across Indigenous communities. And sovereignty is one of those. That is a regular conversation, especially in Oklahoma. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with the 2020 Supreme Court decision, McGirt, which essentially led the Supreme Court to declare or decide that the eastern half of Oklahoma is still considered native reservations. So when Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the state essentially pretended that the reservations that were there before no longer existed. It took over a century, finally, for this issue to get before the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, Congress never abolished those reservations. That is still the jurisdiction of those 5 tribes in the eastern half of the state. So just 4 years ago, a panic broke out a little bit in Oklahoma about who controls what, right? And right now we have lawsuits going on about, can the city of Tulsa ticket citizens of the tribes in the eastern part of the state? It's a little bit of a tangle of knots right now that we're trying to untangle. But these are very real questions about sovereignty, right? About the right to self-govern, to control, and to look out for the well-being of your own citizens that Native peoples have been dealing with for 5 centuries, right? Is this fight for autonomy from a colonial power. So the artworks in this section at first glance may not be obviously referring to this struggle for autonomy and for self-governance, but the more time that you spend with them and maybe the more that you look into their subject matter and the history of what is being illustrated in each of these works, I think the more you'll come to see how multifaceted this topic of sovereignty is in a very real way. So on the right, I think this is a fantastic example by Courtney Leonard, who is Shinnecock from Long Island, of a very real environmental struggle that her community, the Shinnecock Nation, still deals with today, which is the erosion of the coastlines around Long Island. And traditionally, historically, the Shinnecock and other indigenous peoples of what's now kind of the Manhattan area they were marine-based peoples, right? So they relied on their relationship with the ocean and with the life in that ocean. But with the erosion and degradation of those coastlines and the eventual creation of what are essentially concrete reefs, they're artificial reefs placed along that coastline that don't actually really encourage marine life to live there the way that they were originally thought they might do. The Shinnecock are further cut off, right, from the natural resources that they've depended on for millennia for the well-being of their own people. And Courtney talks about how the irony of these artificial reefs along that coastline is that the sand that is used to make the concrete is taken from that area, from the eastern coast of New York, sent to China to be turned into concrete and poured into molds as artificial reefs, and then sent back to New York to be installed along the coastline. And she's getting at this further kind of degradation and removal of resources from Native peoples when the Shinnecock and other communities have offered alternative solutions to these problems. So she's getting at this very rapid degradation of that natural resource in her work in a beautiful, beautiful way, I think. And then Kay Walking Stick's very large painting. I know Janet was stunned when we walked into the gallery last night. It is a rightfully large painting. I think that it does the visitor a lot of good to see it up close in person because you can't quite tell from this projection. But it's a large painting that Walking Stick used, and if you were here last night, you've already heard this, so forgive me, but she used wax in the black paint. so that when she applies that black paint on that large rectangle in the center, it's very thick, right? And when that dries down, she can easily take in size, essentially, into that waxy paint, so you can still see the kind of mottled red base below that. But this is what I take as a reference to sovereignty and kind of the complexities maybe of sovereignty, and that this is an elegy or a kind of memorial for John Ridge, who's a controversial Cherokee citizen and from whom Kay Walking Stick descends. And he was part of a party who were not elected or chosen by the Cherokee people, but who signed their removal treaty with the United States government on behalf of the Cherokee when they were not representatives of that nation. They were just Cherokee citizens. So they ceded millions of acres of Cherokee homeland in exchange for land in what was then Indian Territory and is now Oklahoma. And so Kay Walking Stick, in this piece in particular, and she's done other pieces, other abstract pieces like this that are essentially abstract portraits of Indigenous leaders, of Native leaders. But this one specifically she is described as her own internal struggle with being proud of her citizenship in the Cherokee Nation, on her heritage and the ancestry, from which she comes, but recognizing that that isn't always something that is that can be glorified, right? That our ancestors are also complicated and fallible individuals. And this is again, this could go in the visual abstraction section or even in the identity section, because she's dealing with her own personal identity. But it really comes down to the fact that at that point in time, in the 1834, I believe, was when their removal treaty was signed, and Congress ratified that treaty, even though the actual Cherokee leadership was imploring them not to. Congress went ahead and did it anyways, because they needed that land, right? The United States needed that land for settlement. So clearly these issues are ones that we continue to deal with today in our communities.
And the final issue is identity. And again, there are many different sorts of art objects that reveal our identities, whether it's an item of jewelry or clothing we wear. And certainly one of the most beloved objects that reveal identity is the cradle board that Plains Indian people and other Native people used for their children. And often Plains Indian women would spend hours of loving time and attention beating a cradle board for a niece or a nephew or a grandchild in particular. This cradle board was made by a Kiowa woman named Etta Mopop, and we have both the cradle board and the painting on the right in the show. The painting on the right, painted by her son. A different cradle board, but there were many in the family. And this making of cradle boards has been revived quite a bit in the last 20 or 30 years or so. So there are wonderful descendants of this family and other Kiowa families who continue to make extraordinary, gorgeous beaded cradle boards. Now, because the Gilcrease is so rich in Western art, many people over the years, if you say, well, what do you think of Gilcrease? What are they famous for? They would say Western art or manuscripts or something. So we didn't want to entirely ignore their great collection of art made by predominantly by men, predominantly in the 19th and early 20th century. But we thought we would employ it in a new way, rather than those arts being the last word on Native representation and Native culture. We would use them in a supporting role. How do they help illuminate what Native artists tell us about these ideas and actions and lives of both the past and the present?
And actually in the exhibition, I'm very excited that these two objects were paired near one another, because that was my intention with the selection of these two artworks. So on the left is Ernest Leonard Blumenschein, who was an American artist. He was one of the founding members of the Tau Society of Artists and was very well known for his vibrant and quite distinct, bold representations of his interpretation, let's say, his perception of Pueblo life. And this painting, Superstition, is probably my favorite example of Blumenschein's work for several reasons, but one of which is that it actually speaks to the history of Tewa, or Northern Pueblo, wedding vases, which you can see on the right here by Teresita Naranjo. These are pretty well known now, the shape of this wedding vase. And this double spouted form does have a long history in Pueblo ceramics. It's not a relatively new form by any means, but it being called a wedding vase and associated with a ceremony or a rite like a wedding is a recent phenomenon, and actually came about to appeal to tourists, to be able to sell these types of vessels to people who are not at all familiar with them, right? So you're romanticizing this item so that it's great marketing, right? It's pretty literally romantic. And that's occurring at the same time that Blumenschein is painting Superstition. And that central figure, who is one of his favorite models, Jim Romero, is holding a pretty large wedding vase in his hand there. And out of each spout, there are kind of these ghostly figures, these almost like fog emerging out of each spout of the vessel. And one is a stalk of wheat, and the other is a native man in regalia. He looks like he's dancing. But Blumenschein, rather than using his work to tell the main story, and then using Naranjo's work to kind of show, look, Native people really did make vases and continue to make vases like the one seen in Blumenschein's painting. We wanted to reverse that, right? And focus on Teresita Naranjo's piece first, and this history of translating historic forms and techniques of pottery into marketable goods for new audiences that were coming through New Mexico and throughout the Southwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then looking from there as a result, how that then kind of permeated the artworks of white painters, essentially, in New Mexico.
And one of the artists that people think about when they think about Gilcrease is Charles Marion Russell, who was a great painter and sculptor of Western themes. When he was 15 in 1880, he left St. Louis for Montana because he wanted to work as a rancher and he wanted to make art about ranchers and cowboys and natives. And a few years later, he traveled north into Alberta, Canada, and he lived for some months with the people of the Blood or Kainai Nation. And there he made a number of works of art about subjects that were related to him by Medicine Whip, an old man who had been quite an accomplished warrior in his youth. Now, Medicine Whip hated the Sioux because they had killed his mother when he was a baby. And so as an adult, Medicine Whip made it his business to count Kuan and then also to kill a Sioux warrior with his lance to strike back for his mother's death. And the lance went so deep into his opponent that he couldn't pull it out, so he left it there in him. And then Medicine Whip only had his shield with which to fight. And in this sculpture, Russell conceives of this as one event. Medicine Whip is counting Ku on one crouching man with his right hand, while his left arm is braced against a thick rawhide shield to fend off another opponent who's striking him with an axe. It's a very complex sculpture. And, as an art historian, one often feels like a fraud when you write about something without having seen it in person. And I wrote about this object having only seen this one photograph of it. And then yesterday I see it in the gallery and I think, oh my goodness, it's so much more complex than I believed it to be. Go take a look at it. It's small and it's very hard to figure out what's going on. It's so complicated. Now, if you don't know what counting coup is, it's considered to be the ultimate act of male bravery for a Plains warrior. It's getting up close enough to someone to touch them or strike them, whether it's with your bow or your lance. You don't necessarily want to injure or kill them, though you might. But their interpretation of the white soldiers were that they were not very courageous because they would shoot at you from far away. It doesn't take any particular bravery. You just shoot. But if they could go, ride toward that white soldier and touch them with a lance, then, that showed that they were much braver. Now, we wanted to use this sculpture to help illuminate a beautiful book of 19th century drawings done by Cheyenne and Arapaho men. And here you see a page that shows one of these men who's leaning over the far side of his horse in order to strike his Pawnee opponent with an army saber that he has customized by adorning it with cloth-wrapped feathers. And it's unfortunate that in the two drawing books that we have on display, you can only see one page at a time. So we've chose different pages for the different venues, but this scene of Counting Coup is what we chose here. Now, men on the Great Plains started using these drawing books in about 1860. They replaced the buffalo hides and the elk skin shirts and so forth that they had typically painted their brave deeds on. They kept them for themselves. They would use them to tell each other stories around the fire at night to remember the deeds of their youth. But these also were made as objects to sell. Some of them were commissioned. This one that's on display here was commissioned by a man who ran the trading post at Fort Reno in Indian Territory. And Fort Reno was an interesting place because they had Indian scouts. These were Native men who were on the payroll of the U.S. Army to fight other Native people, usually their traditional enemies. And one of the things so interesting about Indian scouts is that they were far more prosperous than the other people on the reservation. They wore military blue. They earned the same pay as white soldiers, which is something people are always surprised to hear. And they were provided with clothes and rations and food for their horses. They lived in their own encampment near the fort. And so here the Indian scout is depicting himself probably in the years before he became an Indian scout when he was fighting enemies as a young Plains warrior. Now, many exhibits and the apparatus that support them are intended to provide new information to the public. From the start of this project, there was supposed to be a big scholarly catalog with this exhibit. And indeed, Chelsea and I wrote a big scholarly catalog. A big scholarly catalog was edited and sent back to us for our emendations. And then, unfortunately, the American Federation of Arts told us that there was not money to support this catalog. But the directorship of the Gilcrease saved the day, and it will be published as the catalog for the opening of the Gilcrease in 2026. But that doesn't help you. You can't buy one. You don't have it here. So we thought we would each take one object and talk about some of the research and writing that we did about it for the show. We're both scholars, and it's very important to us that people understand how much new scholarly information has been unearthed in the past 40 or 50 years about Native American art. So here's just a couple of examples. Maria Martinez is maybe a name that you know, even if you don't know that much about Native art. She was probably the most famous Native artist in the world, Native North American artist in the world for the first 60 years of the 20th century. There are literally thousands of photographs that capture her at work. She first came to public attention in 1904 when she and her husband, Julian Martinez, spent their honeymoon demonstrating pottery at the St. Louis World's Fair. They also worked on archaeological excavations in New Mexico in 1908 and 1909. And the director of one of these excavations asked Maria if she would try and make some pots that looked like those that they were unearthing from ancestral Pueblo peoples from hundreds of years before. So she and Julian experimented with firing and eventually painting blackware. Now, blackware was made at other Pueblos, but they came up with new innovations. She was very expert at shaping fine, thin-walled pottery, and then patiently burnishing the surface by rubbing it for hours with polishing stones. And when you do this, I've been told that it rearranges the molecules that are on the surface of the vessel, so you come up with a beautiful burnished surface after firing, a lustrous black finish. Now, our plate in the exhibit was not painted by Julian, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but mostly he was also a painter of watercolors, opaque watercolors of the kind that you see in the exhibit, but he also painted his wife's pottery, and he devised a matte painting technique unlike anything used before. So when you make a Pueblo pot, it's usually covered with slip, which is paint, which is clay that has been watered down to the consistency of heavy cream, and you pour that over the vessel. Well, he painted with this slip. And what he did was he painted the negative space so that what he didn't paint had the beautiful burnished surface that Maria had burnished, but then he painted the negative space, say, around the feathers and so forth. And then when this was fired, they produced sort of two levels of black and gray. Now, one of the magical things about Pueblo pottery, this kind of blackware, it doesn't go into the fire black. It goes into the fire red, and then the smoke in the fire turns it black. The woman who actually painted the designs on the platter in the show here was Maria and Julian's daughter-in-law. And you see her here doing her work. She signed this vessel along with Maria. And it's so interesting that Maria and her family became so famous and their work was so sought after that they became among the richest, if not the richest people in their community. They hired Hispanic people to do their farming for them. They hired a Hispanic woman to be their housekeeper. This is sort of the reversal of what we ever think about how Native American people lived. And one thing that I find very moving, because I'm interested in 20th century pottery in general, in 1952, photographer Laura Gilpin took this and many other photos of the three titans of worldwide pottery: the Japanese master potter Shoji Hamada, who was shortly thereafter declared a living national treasure in Japan; the British potter Bernard Leach, who is commonly called the father of studio pottery; and Maria Martinez, the queen of Pueblo pottery. They met each other in their 60s at the height of their fame and the height of their talents. Laura Gilpin took Hamada and Leach to visit Maria in San Ildefonso, and they're looking at her outside pit firing there. And then they invited her to come to a demonstration they were doing at the Museum of International Folk Art, which had just been established in Santa Fe. And they recalled that she looked with keen interest as Hamada, using the potter's wheel, raised a pot. A skilled potter raises a pot in a matter of seconds. Whereas for Maria, you coil and you coil and you smooth, and it takes a long time. And I love the fact that Leach wrote a letter to Maria some years later saying, "This was one of those moments when we three, in unison, managed to break down barriers to make friendship between our people."
All right, and I'll go through this quickly so we still leave time for questions. But I really wanted to highlight the piece in the exhibition by Molly Murphy Adams called "Four Horses Running Fast." And I wanted to highlight it because it pulls in a lot of themes and aesthetics that you can see throughout the exhibition. Molly is an artist of Lakota descent, and she is a very prominent beadwork artist. So she's known she originally started creating creating beaded regalia, so items that were meant to be used in community, either by dancers or in weddings or whatever it might be. And over the years, she started to experiment with and kind of question the forms and the functions of what beadwork for Native people could be. And this is a great example of that questioning. But if you go to the next slide, you can see some of her a little bit earlier work, one with Body Continent, which is another wall hanging, such as Four Horses Running Fast, and then also her one of her QR sewing boxes that actually has a functioning QR codes on the edges of the box and fully beaded, which is not easy to do because you have to get a QR code exactly correct for it to read, for your cell phone to read it. So she has, even to this day in her studio, hundreds of these beaded QR codes that just don't work because there might be one bead, right, that's out of alignment, and she can't bring herself to undo them and reuse the beads quite yet. So these are kind of storied boxes in the sense that you can walk around this particular box and scan each of those QR codes, and it will bring up a different narrative to the story that's being told with this box. It's really fantastic. And then the next slide, you can see Molly working in her studio. So as she started to I won't say move away from, but build on her origin as a regalia beadworker and start looking into the ways that beadwork can be used in other techniques and other finished art forms. She received multiple fellowships. This photograph is her at her studio in Tulsa when she was a Tulsa Artist Fellow, which is a very prestigious award that artists can get in Tulsa. So she was part of that. But I pulled Four Horses Running Fast to highlight here. You can go to the next slide, because it does relate to several other items throughout the exhibition. One is the Evans Ledger book. That's one of the Fort Reno ledger books that you can see. As Janet mentioned, unfortunately, we can't show every page of those books to every venue, but these two images in particular show two couples courting. These are courting scenes, and many, especially Northern Plains communities, have a long history of using what's called courting blankets between couples, where the man wraps the woman in this blanket. And I chose two different types of these blankets, but the one on the right is the one I want you to pay attention to more, because it has this beaded blanket strip across the middle of that blanket. That comes from a tradition of usually sewing two hides together to make one very big hide, and you would cover that seam originally with kind of a quilled piece using porcupine quills, and then later with a beaded strip so that you just don't see this kind of ugly seam through the middle of your animal hide. And that came to be used on trade cloth as well, once wool and other cloth started to be imported into the Americas. So you can go to the next slide. Molly envisioned this courting blanket with a beaded blanket strip, but replaced that very geometric representation on a blanket strip with the heads of four horses. So they're still moving across the length of this red wool. It's broad or trade cloth, moving across the center of that cloth, but in an infinitely more dynamic way, right, than if it were just a band of geometric stripes down the center of that cloth. And each of those four horses is distinct, and not only in its coloring, which is pretty apparent, but also in the types of geometric motifs that she's used to essentially inhabit each of those horses. The one on the far left, that kind of lovely chartreuse green horse, pulls on parfleche or painted rawhide motifs or designs. So this painted rawhide bag or envelope is also in the exhibition. It's one of the pieces that I always expect it to be smaller than it actually is. It is a large painted rawhide, but you can see the types of visual language that is used among communities who have created painted rawhide, or sometimes called parfleche, materials, and how Molly has communicated that specifically into the horse on the far left here.
I think we should end here.
Yes, yeah, I think it's a good ending point.
We had more slides, but we want to have a conversation with you, so we're going to end here. And as was said at the beginning, a microphone will be passed so that your questions and our answers can be part of the recording. So thank you so much for your attention today. Microphone down here.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great show and looking forward to seeing it many times. Do either of you know the Courtney Leonard piece, which is just exquisite, but how did she paint the inside of it? Because the inside is blue.
Yeah, the inside is blue. Yeah, if you look really closely, if you haven't seen it yet, or if you kind of overlooked the interior,
Right.
the inside of the Courtney Leonard piece, it is like a cobalt blue, a pretty bright
It's a
blue.
beautiful blue.
Yes.
So I guess the whole process of how she made that, because it's
So she is infinitely smarter than I am and used scientific processes to create her glazes that I don't quite understand. But the entire vessel or form is essentially submerged in that blue glaze. Okay. But then the slip that's on the outside is different, right? So it goes into the blue glaze, and then she puts a slip just on the exterior.
okay. That makes so much sense.
Yes.
She's smarter than me because I kept looking at it last night and I could not get to that point.
Right,
Okay.
but to make it look like that concrete, but with the blue inside, my mind immediately went to how'd she paint, like how'd she get the blue inside? It's the other way around.
Right, with little brushes inside those holes, But that makes enormous sense. Thank you because I know that question's going to come up.
Of course, yeah. And if you look very closely at that piece, the glaze and the slip that she used has I think it has a high acidity content. I have to go back and look at my notes. But it has a very specific kind of formulation so that when it's fired, it creates this craquelure and bubbling that typically ceramic artists don't want on their glazes, but it really, for me, contributes to the relationship to water, to ocean water.
The blue inside.
Yes.
I can kind of get that. That's the ocean, but how she got it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, somebody else, another question? Your mic is coming.
I really love the ledger books, and so I was wondering, have many of them survived, number one? And number two, do they tell a story, like a progression from page to page? Can they be seen as a person's bio in a way? Yeah.
Well, settle in for another hour, because this is my scholarly letter.
She's
area
written
of
books on
expertise.
this.
Okay, briefly, hundreds of them have survived, and some of them, they're being uncovered because many of them came down in families who didn't know what they were. And then only in the past 40 years or so have people looked at these as art objects, and they've been auctioned today for very high prices. Some of them were books that were passed around by different men, and some would draw a few images of his war exploits. The other one would draw a few. Others do have a theme. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I wrote a book called Spirit Beings and Sun Dancers, and that was a book that was, why doesn't this happen to me? It was discovered at a Goodwill in a file cabinet, sold at Sotheby's for the highest price ever paid for a Native American work of art, and luckily immediately went into the Thaw collection at the museum in Cooperstown, and I was able to write a book on it. And it was all by one man who was paid page by page by a trader to draw whatever he wanted about his people. And this man chose to not have anything about the white man in there. It's about ceremony, it's about the past, it's about warfare, it's about the animals, but no white people. And he was doing it in the 1880s as a time when the deluge of white culture was coming over his people. So it's a fascinating story, and people have done children's books based on ledger books, and of course, it's the perfect thing for a digital presentation of art. One of our colleagues, Joe Horscapture, when he was curator at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, I believe he did an installation where you could see the one page in the book, but then you could press a button and you could see pictures of the other pages, which is really what needs to be done to show a book like that. Anybody else?
Okay. There's a number of the art has clown dancers. I've seen online, at powwows and so forth, but is that common? I mean, in other ceremonies, other than for just, I know they're not just for tourists, right? I mean, they've had clown dancing.
Right.
But can you say anything about, because there's a couple, it's more than one place in the exhibition.
Right.
That you see the clown dancers, and how important are they to the ceremony?
So yes, they are. I think often when people are maybe familiar with sacred clowns or ceremonial clowns, it's often with Pueblo communities, with the Koshare, and because those have been pictured often, right? There you typically will see like the black and white striped painted bodies, and so they're very familiar, I think, for visual arts. But many indigenous communities in North America have a similar figure. Might not be called clown or sacred clown. The Lakota and Dakota have Heoka. The southeastern communities have similar figures, and it very often they serve a similar function. I won't say the same function, but they serve a similar function of one, pointing people in the direction of proper performance during a ceremony. So making, they will do, it's almost satirical kind of representation of inappropriate behavior, right? So that the sacred clowns are doing that inappropriate behavior, so people who are participating or observing the ceremony should not be doing what they're doing, right?
So they teach by bad example.
Yes, and I'll say for some southeastern communities, they're kind of akin to a trickster figure, right? Where they are mischievous, they can cause problems, but they still serve a very vital role in the ceremonial and daily lives of those societies that have them present. So yeah, you can find a similar figure in the ceremonial lives of communities across more than just North America, but for the purposes of this exhibition, yeah, North America.
I was lucky enough to see the Hopi snake dance in the 1970s, and there are clowns that act as the policemen at that performance. And there was a white viewer there who was wearing a big Stetson hat, and it was pristine, it was really clean. He had clearly just bought it, he was so proud of it. The clowns came over to him, they took his hat, and they started throwing it back and forth. And he didn't like that. He didn't know enough to know what this was about. And the rest of us, who knew what clowns do, we were just watching it. And they started talking to him. Well, it turned out he was German. Oh no, this made it worse. Oh, my father fought you people during World War II. The clown the hat goes back and forth. And we all had the feeling that it was going to be like stomped in the dirt. And he was like getting steamed. And then finally they just gave it back to him. So it's just something that's lighthearted fun for the rest of the crowd, not so much for this German guy. But it's wonderful to see the clowns in action. Often one thing the clowns do is they're often very rude. They'll say filthy things. They'll go up to the oldest Pueblo ladies and whisper in their ears, saying filthy, sexy things, and the ladies will just giggle, and the rest of us don't get to hear it. It's a fascinating phenomenon, this whole idea of clowning as a ritual activity.
But they do, there's also great ways of keeping people in line, right? So maybe I don't know if the Stetson maybe was a faux pas. He shouldn't have been wearing the hat, or they were just getting at him for it.
Yeah.
But there are also at most of the Pueblos, if you are there for one of their public dances, there are still signs that say photography is not allowed. You cannot depict or take photographs of what happens here. Doesn't mean people don't still try, especially people not from that Pueblo. So the the clowns will take a camera if they see one being pulled out of a bag or, from behind someone's jacket, and throw it in the river. It's just, I've seen that happen a couple of times at Taos. That it just is, we asked you nicely. There are signs posted all over the place. Please don't take photographs of us. Otherwise, we can't have these as public events anymore. So the clowns will take care of it for them,
Well, maybe this is a good place to stop.
Oh, Gio.
Thank you so much for this chance for us to be able to hear you speak on the show. Because this is such a valuable opportunity, and also I promised our docents that the program will touch on it, can you very briefly, if you could, speak on the NAGPRA and the state of the regulations and laws and what that means to museums and Indigenous peoples?
Absolutely. Yes,
Okay,
thank you
but
for that question.
any people who need to leave, we will not think you're rude if you leave after an hour. But these are the slides that I went past really quickly. People always ask about NAGPRA, and NAGPRA has been something that's been going on since 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and it has totally reoriented the relationship between Native peoples and the museums that hold their objects. It only relates to museums that get federal funding. Doesn't relate to your private collection, doesn't relate to a collection that doesn't get anything from the government. And these are the categories that it covers. And so we just wanted to give you examples. So funerary objects are subject to repatriation. Doesn't mean it has to go back. It means you have to tell the tribe you have these, and they decide, do you get to keep it? Do they want it back? Do they think it is filled with so much power that living people today are not coped to deal with? So it's like an irradiated object. You keep it. You get irradiated. We don't want it, One of these is funerary objects. So, for example, this shaman figure that you see in situ on a shaman's grave in Alaska. And I haven't been to the new exhibition of the American Museum of Natural History, so I don't know if it's been taken off display, but it was on display in the American Museum of Natural History for decades. Sacred objects. Well, we're not illustrating a sacred object for you. Why? Because these are particular things that many Native people really do not want on display in museums. Things that may be private, ceremonial, things that are only supposed to be seen and used and handled by people who have been initiated into particular societies. If you are the wrong gender, you're not supposed to see it. If you're a child, you're not supposed to see that it is a mask rather than something that is worn, that is a sacred being that comes in from the outside world. So there's a big reorientation now about sacred objects in the museum. Objects of cultural patrimony. An example from close to home, Haudenosaunee wampum belts are a very good example of cultural patrimony. They are objects that are legal documents, in effect. They have many uses, but one of the most important is as a legal document that shows a treaty or a relationship between two differing groups. And most of these have been taken out of American museums and sent back to their owners. And then in recent months, there's been a whole series of NAGPRA updates that Chelsea knows way more about than I do, and that she has been actively working with her museum.
Right. So as Janet mentioned, NAGPRA has been enacted since 1990, and so museums such as Gilcrease have had to be working on these repatriation efforts since then, which we have. And because it can be a very slow process, but the work itself is very important. Our tribal partners who we work with on these repatriations and consultations are incredibly patient with us in return. So I included 2 photographs here of a recent consultation that we did with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes who are based in Oklahoma. These are items that are not protected, so it's okay to include these photographs. But this was an NAGPRA consultation that was a follow-up from a previous consultation that had been done a couple years ago with them. But our collections managers happened to find a couple of items when we were moving out of our building, our old building that's been demolished, that hadn't been included. They weren't aware that they were in our collection. So our NAGPRA coordinator, called up the Cheyenne and Arapaho and said, hey, we've got a couple of more items. We really, we want you to come look at them before we decide what to do with them. So they came out and did that. Those few items actually included a couple of things that we had looked at for this exhibition. And so this checklist has gone through a few iterations of items to be included in Pass Forward. And most of the items that came off of that list were either due to condition, we mentioned earlier, some things are too fragile to travel outside of Tulsa, really, but also due to repatriations. That it just happened that, an item came up during a consultation over the last 2 years, and so we removed it from the checklist, and that has now been, taken care of by our museum team and the tribe. These new updates that we're talking about just went into effect in January of this year, and the updates are much needed, but they're a big adjustment. So they give tribes more control, which is, my personal opinion, always a good thing when tribal governments are the ones who are making decisions about their own heritage and their own culture and history. But it also means that's a much larger burden on them, on the tribes, because they have to now go to museums and say, hey, this item might not be subject to repatriation. It might not fall under one of those categories of being funerary or sacred or an object of cultural patrimony, but we also are not comfortable with it being on display. You don't have our permission to display it. So there's now one of the big updates that most museums are having to figure out how to abide by is things that are also already on display, right? That again, maybe didn't fall under those repatriation guidelines before, but that we now need written permission from those communities to display it. So we've had to make some last minute adjustments to the items that you see on display, which again, I think is always a good thing for those communities in which those items originated. But it will be an ongoing, I think, kind of never-ending process of making sure that the items that we care for should be cared for by us in the first place.
But for a museum like yours that has one of the best standing repatriation processes and relationships with Native communities all across your larger region, it's one thing. But the museums that are just shaking their heads now are say a museum in New England who, yes, they've followed repatriation law guidelines, but they have not really maintained relationships with other groups. Now to need written permission for certain things, museums are in a tizzy about this, and I think we'll watch this shake out over the next few years. I don't know how it will play out.
It's another good example of why you should maintain ongoing relationships with the communities who are represented in your collection, whether or not it seems like the museum itself is getting anything out of it, right? Or if they're not like tangible benefits. it's clearly the right thing to do because we are incredibly lucky that we don't have to play catch up really as much as some other museums with these updated guidelines. Yes.
I understand how laws like this affect museums like the American Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian and the British Museum, whatever.
Doesn't affect
the
the
British
British Museum, it just affects American museums.
American museums, but there are laws that in other countries that do affect their museums in similar ways. Is your museum sort of grandfathered into this because
No.
it was founded and the collection was started by
Nope.
a tribal member?
Nope.
Interesting.
No. Yeah. And again, it's kind of going back to what I was getting at with K walking sticks for John Ridge painting. Our ancestors, the people who came before us, were fallible, right? Just because someone was native doesn't mean that they didn't participate in colonial harm against other native people.
Grave robbing, for example.
Yep. And that's one thing that one way that we've been incredibly proactive with repatriations and with tribal consultations is we have compared to other collections, some clear documentation on a lot of our archaeological materials because Thomas Gilcrease himself funded archaeological digs. And so there's documentation of the archaeologists he hired, the sites they visited, when those objects came, the funerary materials and ancestral materials came into Thomas Gilcrease's collection. So that doesn't absolve him, right? Him simply being a Muskogee citizen. And that's actually one thing that we're highlighting in one of the galleries of the new museum is, it's not to glorify the founder or the significant collector of a particular museum, but to really analyze how is where we are right now a result of these decisions that have been made over the last century. So no, we don't get any exceptions, and frankly, if we did, I wouldn't I wouldn't be okay with that. I would still fight to return things home.
Years ago in the 1970s, I drove to Kansas City to see a show that was brought from Europe, Sacred Circle. In that show were large pieces, that comprised many of the collections, primarily from Germany and France, which never made their way back to Americas, which affected Plains Indians, particularly Sioux and Lakota, Dakota, Nakota. I know there are World Heritage laws in place, and I don't know if you can comment on whether or not some of that might affect European museums. Anyway.
In terms of that show, it was organized by Ted Coe, who was then curator at the Nelson Atkins Gallery in Kansas City, but it opened in England for the bicentennial. And he had contacts all over. So yes, they were things from American collections and European collections, but it was not a European show. There are a small number of European curators who are increasingly taking this more seriously as a moral obligation, if not a legal one. But many do not. It's like, those are your laws, they have nothing to do with us. But I think for some museums, the fact that they have gone through some of this about Holocaust objects makes it easier for them to understand the American Holocaust. And so little by little, I think things will change. But
a fantastic example of how things haven't changed quite as much over there as maybe they have here is the British Museum. They have, in fact, have a mandate from Parliament and from the Crown to not give anything back. They're giving things back to communities in Africa, in Australia and New Zealand, but they have I don't know why or how it came about, but there is an order to the administrators of the British Museum. Things are not to be returned to North America. and it was a response, is what I've been told by folks who know better than I do, to NAGPRA being enacted and pressure being put on other large museums outside of the United States. Canada right now is in the process of developing similar legislation to NAGPRA, but they're coming up against some resistance because they're also still under the British Crown. France, I was telling Janet just an anecdote the other night. I'm Choctaw, and we have a long history with the French. The vast majority of our material culture that predates 1700 currently and since 1700 has resided in Paris in the royal collection. It's now at the Musée de Quai Branly. Our nation only just found out about all of these items within the last decade, and went over to Paris to see them in person and found examples of material culture that we didn't know we had ever made, because they had been exported primarily by French missionaries and fur traders along the Mississippi. They'd been exported back to the kings in France at such large rates, such serious exportation of these goods, that really quickly the people who knew how to create these were unable to pass it on to the next generation. France has the Quai Branly has already told Choctaw Nation, you're not getting any of this back. You can come see it whenever you want, but the French government has no interest in deaccessioning anything that's been part of the royal collection. And we have no recourse. We have zero recourse. So, yeah. It's a little sad note to end on, except, to say that change can come.